Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Roland Zenology Pro tutorial series. Today we're going to take a change of tack. We've spent several episodes having a look at all of the major components of Zenology Pro, but I think now's the time where we need to start putting it into some sort of real-world context. So we're going to do the first of several preset deep dives today, where we take one of the stock presets out of the preset library and we pull it to bits in order to find out how the thing lives and breathes as a real-world synthesizer. Now I've selected this preset, which is a Ep.8 preset, from the preset C bank, Synth Legend bank, and it sounds like this. Classic early 80s Jupiter sound, and there are some really interesting discussion points in this preset that we'll touch on today. The first thing that we have to do when we're deconstructing a preset is to figure out what our process is going to be. There are two different fundamental approaches that you can take. You can either strip single pieces away bit by bit until you get down to an atomic level, or you can actually throw a load of stuff away at the beginning of the process and build it back up. And depending on the preset that we're actually deconstructing, either approach is completely reasonable. As you can see in the structure window, what we've got in this sound is three independent partials. They're all feeding into an effects unit as well. We've not dealt with the effects unit explicitly yet, but it's actually pretty straightforward. There's this module called Multi-FX or MFX, and it sits as a single block at the end of the output chain. So all of the partials can feed into it, but they all feed into the same device. So we've basically got one master effects unit at the end of all of the other processing through which the partials can be optionally routed. Now if we have a look quickly in the Pro Edit screen and have a look at our output section, you can see here this is where we control the master output from each partial as to whether or not it's routed into the multi-effects unit or not. That is then overridden by whether or not the FX unit is on or off. Now at the moment it's on, and we've got a modulation delay setting. We'll have a closer look at that in detail later, but for now I'm actually just going to turn it off and take it straight out. And so we've immediately simplified the sound because the delay bounce that we're getting off the modulation delay unit is no longer present. I'm going to go one step further than that and throw two of the partials away as well. I'm going to bring all of this stuff back in later, but for now I'm just going to concentrate on partial 1. Something going on with detune there. We're hearing quite clearly some pitch modulation, and we've also got some filter sweep effects, and I want to have a look at that tonal effect as well. There's some sort of modulation going on with the tone, so lots of different things to look at. Firstly, let's have a look at it in the visual edit screen, because when we're just looking at partial 1, we get a really nice overview of the entire partial. You can see we've got a virtual analog pulse wave here, and we've got some PWM depth coming from LFO2, which basically means the width of this pulse is being dynamically modulated. Now that's not the only dynamic sound that's being applied to this partial, and it's really difficult to identify any individual thing if two or more modulation effects are happening simultaneously. I'm going to disengage this filter. We have an envelope on the filter that's having an effect on the sound. I'm just going to control click to take that away. Let's see what we're left with. Okay, we're getting a pretty simple sound now. We've still got some modulation. You can actually see the pitch going up and down in the tuner, and we can see this pulse width really clearly now on the oscilloscope. If I take that away, sound is now static, but can you see this bouncing backwards and forwards? That's pitch variance. By seeing more or fewer waves in the oscilloscope, it basically means the pitch is being varied. Now this is actually coming from the analog feel control in the common settings. Basically analog feel does exactly that. It applies a little bit of random pitch variance to the tone to emulate the fact that that's what analog synthesizers were like. They weren't absolutely static. If I take analog feel away, now we're left with an absolutely flat tone, bang on 130.67 Hertz. Now that number 130.67 when I press a C is significant. Bear that in mind, we'll come back to it later. Okay, so we've tunneled down to the point where we have a simple, pretty easily understandable wave. Obviously, if we play with this pulse width, we're going to get tonal variance, but I'm not worrying about that just now. Now I'm going to bring the filter envelope back in so that we can hear what that was doing to the sound. And we can really clearly see this in Impulse, the spectrum analyzer, pulling all of those high frequencies away as we sweep through the frequency curve. Let's have a look at the envelope, and here it is. We start at maximum cutoff, and then we pull that cutoff back, and we see that sweep. -24 is the most intense of the decibel per octave ratios we have. So we have the steepest curve. Now with that envelope in play, we bring the pulse width modulation back in, you'll hear the tone pulsing as well as the envelope sweeping. You can hear the rate of the LFO. If I slow the LFO down, we're getting a really good understanding now of how all of these components are working together and how this sound's constructed. Now, as I've been messing with this sound and changing all of these different controls, I haven't been putting them back exactly where they were in the first place. So something that I very commonly do when I'm deconstructing presets is throw the preset away, get back to it. And I'll actually quite commonly create myself temporary presets. So I could, for instance, turn both partials off the multi-effects unit, and I could save that state as a preset and just call it temporary. And now I'll be able to recall that whenever I want, if I want to get back to this stage. But that's the sound more or less out of the box. We've reintroduced the pulse width modulation and the filter envelope, and that gives us this. Now let's bring the modulation delay back in and see what the multi-effects unit's doing. Okay, obviously it's a delay. If I press a very short note, I'll play a high note. You can hear the delay bouncing, but you can also hear that there's a kind of almost chorus effect. A little bit difficult to identify with all of the other modulations in. In fact, what I'll do is I'll take the analog field back out and the pulse width modulation. I'll leave the envelope sweep. But apart from that, we've got a relatively static tone now. But you can hear that shimmer. That's coming from the modulation side of the modulation delay. What's basically happening here is we've got two separate independent delay units. It's a genuinely stereo delay. And you can see that they're offset in time, which basically means that they're bouncing off each other. In addition to that bouncing effect, each one of those delays is independently having its pitch modulated, and the pitch modulation is coming from a combination of these rate and depth knobs here. Now, even though it's called modulation, modulation is a generic term that doesn't actually mean anything in its own right. It could be chorus, flange, phase. In this case, it's actually pitch modulation. Pitch modulation is one of the core components of of effects that go on to become chorus and flange if you do enough different processing with them. What happens with choruses and flanges is that you have an original wave, you make a duplicate copy of it, and then you put a delay time onto the copy, and then you modulate the delay time. You actually change the speed of the delay on the copy, whereas the original wave is completely static. The interrelationship between those two waves generates, it starts off at flanger for very, very tiny delay effects, and then if you make the delay effect long enough, it becomes a chorus. Well, that's kind of what's going on here. We don't have that original delay offset in the left and right channels, but we do have the modulation of the pitch. Just to prove that it really is pitch variance that we're talking about here, if I pull the rate right down and the depth all the way up, you can actually hear the independent pitch changes. But that's not what this effect unit's designed to be used for. Predominantly, we have a faster rate than that. So it becomes increasingly difficult to identify those changes in pitch, and then we pull the depth right down to make it much, much more subtle. And it gets us back into a kind of chorus territory. One of the other primary differences between flanges and choruses is that flanges generally have feedback control and choruses generally don't. So you kind of get to choose what flavour of modulation you're going to be talking about. If you increase feedback, you're going to be heading typically more into the flange territory. All of this stuff is, I'm using woolly terms because they do cross over, they cross-pollinate quite heavily, and in this particular case, because we don't have the original offset of what would essentially be the copy wave, we're not truly operating in flange and chorus territory either. It's a unique effect. So there's the feedback signal going back in, and then that's being modulated, and you can hear that really clearly. This is a perfect opportunity for me to use my temporary preset to get back to the stage before I did all that messing with the modulation, and we'll bring it back in. And we're back to our core sound. What I'm going to do now is turn partial 1 off, turn partial 2 on, and challenge you to hear the difference between these two partials. You basically don't stand a chance. The difference between partial 1 and partial 2 is incredibly subtle. If I get us back to a really raw sound again, take away the analog feel, the PWM depth, and we have no modulation delay, we're going to get a static tone. Watch the tuner. 130.96. Remember when I said take a note of partial 1's pitch earlier? Just take its pulse width modulation away again. 130.67. So there's 0.3 of a hertz, a third of a single cycle difference between the tuning of these two partials. Now when you hear them on their own, that's pretty much indiscernible. There's 1, there's 2. Watch what happens when you turn them both on together though. You get an effect called unison detune. So what you've got here is two absolutely static tones. You saw the tuner, it was smack on. But when you combine those two waves together, they're cycling at different pitches, and therefore the harmonics of those two waves are going to react dynamically. And so you can see the tuners bouncing backwards and forwards. You can see all of the harmonics dancing in Insight. You see the oscilloscope in action. Everything suddenly becomes mobile. Unison detune is one of the great ways to thicken a sound up by having multiple copies of a wave very, very slightly offset. And that's what partials 1 and 2 are doing. We can verify that very easily in the Pro Edit screen. And this is actually a really great way to find what's been done to a sound. If you scroll through the Pro Edit screen and you basically take a wide angle view at all 4 partials simultaneously, or all 3 in this case, wherever you see different values, that's something that's been programmed into the preset. So as we scroll down, we in fact see that all of the waves are fundamentally built similarly. Even the pulse width of each of the 3 waves is the same value. But when we get to the pitch section, here is the difference between partial 1 and 2. Partial 1 is offset -2, partial 2 is offset +2. So that's 2 cents, 2 100ths of a semitone. So the difference between these two partials is 4 100ths, or a 25th of a semitone, a really tiny fraction. Now let's bring partial 3 into the story, and I'll press my C. But we're not hearing a C. In fact, if you look in the tuner, pretty big smoking gun there. It's a G, 7 semitones above the original tone. So partial 3 is harmonizing with the original 2 partials. I'm pressing a C on the keyboard, but we're hearing a G, which is 7 semitones higher, and here you can see the coarse offset of 7. So what's going on basically here is that partials 1 and 2 are creating the unison detune, that lovely thick motion-filled tone. And partial 3 is providing the perfect 5th overtone, the strongest overtone. When we bring all those 3 partials together, pressing a single key on the keyboard there, and you have this insta chord. This tone that you're hearing here is basically the component of a power chord, a root plus a perfect fifth. And it just gives you a fabulous, thick, rich, harmonic filled sound. When we then reintroduce the multi-effects, which is going to basically take that thick, rich sound and then apply extra modulation to it by offsetting these two tones through different delay units and modulating their pitch very slightly. Again, one single note. Now you've got so many different voices going into that sound that it's immediately thick. So at this point we've dealt with the fundamental components of the tone. That's how the tone is built. There's one final thing to look at in this preset though, and it's in the matrix control. This isn't a section we've dealt with explicitly yet, but we have touched on it briefly when we had a look at the LFO. That's an example of the kind of thing that we're talking about here, where we have basically programmable modulation units. What we've got in the matrix control is 4 separate modulation units. So let's have a look at control 1 here. So what we're saying here is that a thing, some sort of control coming out of the synthesizer, is going to modulate one or more other things somewhere else in the synthesizer. In this case for control 1, the source is this syscontrol 1, is a curious Roland-ism for CC value 1, which is almost always mapped to the modulation wheel, and in fact it is on this synthesizer. So it's basically telling us that when we move the mod wheel, something's going to happen to this synthesizer. And this is a top tip if you're deconstructing presets. Always start your preset deconstruction with your modulation wheel turned down, because very many presets use the mod wheel and it's going to colour your sound. So I'm going to press the same C on my keyboard and then I'm going to increase the mod wheel and we'll see what happens. There it goes. So we're getting pitch variance. You can see the control 1 destination is the only one that's in use. The other 3 destinations, you can have up to 4 separate destinations per control module. So we're just using one of them here and it's mapped to the pitch LFO. In other words, it's equivalent to turning up this value here. In the pitch module, we have the ability to tie the LFO to it. We saw that when we looked at the pitch module. Increase the LFO, pitch goes up and down. Well, we're basically achieving that, but rather than doing it dynamically from this control in the pitch window, we're doing it from the modulation wheel. Modulation wheel all the way down, modulation wheel all the way up, pitch modulation. It's quite subtle because the value's only at 13. If I crank that up, now that's fine for control 1 and that's that dealt with, but if you have a look down at control 2, that's also taking a feed from the modulation wheel. But this time the destination is the LFO rate. So at the same time that we increase the depth of the pitch modulation, you just heard it get more intense, we're actually also speeding it up. Modulation wheel all the way down, press my note, and now as the pitch modulation starts to come in, it's quite slow, and then it's going to speed up. There we go. So it's a really interesting use of 2 different control modulations, taking the same source but mapping to different destinations. Now we've also got something going on control module 3. This time it's taking a mapping of syscontrol 2 or CC2 in our case, and CC2 is mapped to aftertouch. So if I press a note on my keyboard, I'm now going to press into the aftertouch region. There we go. Pull back again. So what's happening there is that as I press into the aftertouch, it's increasing the filter cutoff. See, we've got cut set here. And as we drill into these menus, you can see all the different source and destination options you've got available to you. And that's it for this preset deep dive. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.